All right, welcome everyone. We are so excited to have you all here today with us for our webinar focused on Turnaround for Children's new toolbox. Throughout the session, we'll be sharing ideas and resources with you to support your work designing settings for more equitable whole child, for a more equitable whole child approach. After today's webinar, you will have access to a recording of the session, a transcript, all of the materials we share today, and of course, the toolbox site as a whole. But before we jump in, I'd love to know just a little bit more about each of you. So if you could each tell us a little bit about yourself in the chat, we'd love to know where you're joining us from and what your role is for your work in schools. Be sure to select all panelists and attendees when you share so that we can all see where you are coming from. Welcome, everyone. I love that we are already spanning coast to coast, just like our team here at Turnaround. And some Canadians, so love going in both directions. Welcome from Colorado. That's also where I'm joining from today.
Welcome DC area as well.
I see some fellow New Yorkers.
I was about to say, Mount Vernon in the house over here. Welcome, welcome.
Hey, and I was hoping for someone from Minnesota. That's where I grew up.
Yay. That's so great. And as you all continue to sort of stream in, I'm also going to introduce quickly our Q&A feature. So throughout the webinar, this is a place where you can add any questions that you have about the toolbox, either based on the presentation from today or based on your previous explorations. And so as you see our other participants start to join, feel free to start to add any questions using that feature. Awesome. So now that we are starting to have a sense of who's in the room, we'd love to briefly discuss our agenda for today. We're going to complete the welcome and introduction section momentarily by introducing all of the panelists who you have here with you today. Then we'll take you on an interactive virtual tour of the toolbox to orient you to the resource. And then next, we're going to invite each of our panelists to share a tool or resource from the toolbox that they're particularly excited about. We'll close with some time for Q&A and hopefully get to some of those questions that you're adding into the Q&A feature, and then share a little bit of information about what you can look out for from us next. All right, so this is your team from Turnaround today. We're super lucky to have this group here. I'm on the left. My name's Elizabeth Miller, and I design content here at Turnaround. I recently relocated from our New York office to Denver, Colorado, which is where I am joining you from today. Prior to joining Turnaround, I taught 3rd through 6th grade in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in Boulder, Colorado. So that's a little bit about my background, and I'd love to pass it to Heidi and then down the line.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Heidi Reed, and at Turnaround, I'm the Director of Professional Learning. I work on designing and also implementing both internal and external professional learning experiences here. And before I joined Turnaround, I taught and led in DC for 10 years, mostly at the middle school level in a variety of roles, was a former science teacher, all the way through to assistant principal. So glad to see everybody here and can't wait to learn more about all of your roles and your challenges as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm MenSa Ankh Maa. I'm a partnership director with Turnaround for Children. I'm a lifelong educator. Started off as a middle school teacher here in Washington, D.C. Before spending many years as a pre-K through 7th grade, 8th grade, excuse me, principal here in DC, as well as in Prince George's County and Holmes County, Mississippi. And I'm just very excited to share with you all today. I'll pass it to Laura.
Hello, everybody. My name is Laura Sykes. I also work on our content design team here at Turnaround. And before joining this team, I was a second, third, and fourth grade teacher here in Harlem, New York, which is still where I am, coming to you from Brooklyn. And I'm really excited to dive in. Thank you all for being here.
Awesome. Thank you all. Again, so grateful to have each of you with us today. All right, so let's jump into our virtual tour. So first, we wanted to share just a little bit more about why we did this project. So as we know, you're all acutely aware, this year has presented really inordinate challenges, and we've witnessed educators grappling with some really complex questions, like how can we support learning and growth when our relationships with students have been uprooted? How can we equitably address the disruptions to traditional education when we return to schools? And what can we do to foster collective well-being amidst ongoing racialized violence and a public health crisis? And these questions have really highlighted for us the importance of a whole child approach and confirmed how crucial this is to put all students on the path to thriving. So the Toolbox is our first attempt to share these insights super broadly for free in a way that hopefully works for each of you, given your unique contexts. And, we've created tools and resources, but also know it's really the work that each of you do with students and your expertise and passion that bring this work to life. And so knowing that we're each at different starting points, we wanted to understand just a little bit more about each of your experiences with the Toolbox. I'm gonna launch a poll for us. Awesome. It's great to see these results in. It looks like we have a lot of you are brand new to the Toolbox, which is really exciting. I think today should be a great opportunity for you to really get started with these tools. And then those of you who have explored a little bit more, I think that this will hopefully be an opportunity for you to learn about some new resources. Again, be sure to use that Q&A feature for any questions that have come up as you've started to explore. So thank you all for participating in that. All right, so we're going to play a real quick video just to overview the Toolbox before we jump into our tour.
To fix the deep inequities in our school systems, we need to build with a new blueprint. And if you're looking for inspiration to spark your work creating holistic, equitable learning experiences for your students, you're not alone. The Turnaround for Children Toolbox is an online hub for ideas and resources that empower educators to redesign classrooms, schools, and systems by taking a whole child approach. It starts with the science on how kids really learn and develop. Our whole child design blueprint synthesizes research across fields like neuroscience, psychology, and developmental science to make it usable and actionable in any school setting. The Toolbox was created by educators for educators. You'll find assessments, planning guides, videos, articles, and more to help you on your journey. With these tools, you'll be set up to collaborate with other educators, your students, and school community to make change happen. Create a supportive environment, cultivate developmental relationships, and build students' knowledge, skills, and mindsets, all centered around a whole child purpose. So, bring your expertise and passion, and we'll bring the research and resources to get you started. Together, we can design our schools to be places where each student can thrive. To fix the deep inequities in our school.
Awesome. So, as you just heard, the Turnaround for Children Toolbox is really an online hub for resources that empower educators to redesign classrooms, schools, and systems by taking a whole child approach. And you'll note that the site is full of content that's grounded in the science of learning and development and driven by equity. The Turnaround for Children Toolbox is not a program or a one-size-fits-all approach. Instead, it's a place for each of you, teachers, leaders, student support staff, caregivers, and more, to really reimagine together what our classrooms and schools can be if we take a whole child approach. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to share the site. And I'm going to stop my share.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. I have the joy of actually doing a little virtual tour. So welcome to the Turnaround for Children Toolbox, especially for folks who have not had a chance to dive in yet. I'm going to do a brief overview so you can get a sense of how the site is organized and what there is to explore. And then we'll dive deeper with my colleagues in a few minutes about some specific tools and resources. And first and foremost, before we get into any of the pages, I just want to say there is no right or wrong place to start. There are many entry points into this work, and there are many entry points into the toolbox. I'm going to get us started with the science section, one of my personal favorites. So as we described, our goal with this toolbox is to bring together the best of what we know from research and practice to transform our schools. And so the purpose of this section is to actually dig into that research on how kids really learn and develop so that we can use that understanding in our design work. And so this section is organized around 5 key insights from the science. Things like development is bidirectional, context matters, learning is integrated, kids' pathways are unique, and student voice is critical. And as you explore this section of the toolbox, you're also going to find resources like videos that share the science in an accessible way and curated sets of research articles. The science section is a great place to start if you're really interested in building your background knowledge on how development happens and using that to inspire your next steps in this work. Another starting place into this work is through the WholeChild design section of the toolbox. And the purpose of this section is to provide ideas and resources to actually use that science that we were just looking at to actually start to change our practice. This section is organized around our framework called the blueprint. And as we mentioned, this is not a prescriptive model or program, but this framework is meant to be used as a visioning tool that organizes some of the most important things for us as educators to be thinking about as we move towards this whole child approach in ways that honor our school community's specific assets and challenges. So to learn more about any of the 5 components of our framework or the core practices within them, you can just click on the framework. I'm going to take us into supportive environments as an example. And for each of these components, for example, here in supportive environments, you'll find resources that help paint a clearer picture of what that piece actually looks like in action. So for supportive environments here, you'll find things on this page like a video on building a belonging classroom or a 1-pager on characteristics of what makes a classroom co-regulating for students and more. For all of our components, as we saw in the framework, there are also core practices that you can dive into to start trying something new. And so I'm going to take us into the core practice for expectations, norms, and routines. There are lots of things to get you started if you're ready to dive into redesigning around a core practice. There are things like continuums, which are like rubrics, but better. There are planning guides, self-assessments, strategies to use with students, more videos and articles, lots of ways to dive in. And so this WholeChild design section is a great starting place for you if you are someone who likes to learn by doing, and you sort of know what area of practice you might want to focus on and you're ready to just jump right in. And then finally, our last section of the toolbox focuses on measurement. And so the purpose of this section is to provide tools that have a different approach to assessment. Instead of evaluating just student performance, these are tools that will do things like measure the context we create for learning, or paint a holistic picture of young people and how they're actually doing right now. So this section is organized around 2 sets of tools. One is about assessing your school's existing system structures and practices. This is called the WholeChild inventory. And another set of tools that are about assessing individual students' overall wellness and really bringing their voice into the conversation. And that's called the Wellbeing Index. And so the measurement section is a great starting place if you want to step back and take stock of where you and your students are at as a way to decide your direction. So that is our very quick tour of the Toolbox site, with much more to be added in coming months. So this is just our first step. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Laura. So as Laura described, there are so many great starting points to engage in whole child design using the Toolbox. And one thing that we always recommend to educators is that they start by reflecting on the challenges that they see in their unique context, so that any changes that they make are grounded in the needs of their students. And so we'd love to take just a moment and hear from each of you in the chat a little bit more about a challenge that you've faced as you've worked to implement whole child practices in your work. So you can go ahead and start to share that in the chat. This will also drive topics for future webinars and conversations that we have about how to improve the Toolbox. As you're adding to the chat, you can also start to think about building off of what our panelists share next about the challenges that they've faced in their own work. Yeah, Sydney, I'm excited about some future tools that we'll have on the site around family, caregiver, and community partnership. Yeah, so many of these are such real challenges and really resonate. Yeah, Brenda, hopefully you find what we have useful. So we're going to continue, but again, feel free to keep adding to this list and responding to what our panelists share if it resonates. All right, so as we talked about, we're next going to move into some time to hear about specific resources from the Toolbox site. These resources will span 3 elements of our whole child design blueprint: developmental relationships, knowledge, skill, and mindset building, and supportive environments. As Laura mentioned, all of these elements are integrated and really reinforce one another. So each step, insight, or practice that you take on will really support the next. And with that, I would love to turn it over to you, Heidi, to share a tool or resource that you're particularly excited to share with educators and why.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for the introduction. Just the walkthrough. I think I got really excited and already lost in people's comments chatting like, where's your entry point? Where's something that is a challenge you're experiencing? So one of the tools that I'm going to share with you today is actually one that I picked from the Toolbox because of a challenge I would experience when I was in the classroom. So I know I mentioned before that I was a teacher, but I was also a grade level leader, a department chair, an instructional coach, and assistant principal. And this specific tool I wanted to highlight because it could be used in different ways for any of those roles. So specifically, the tool I wanted to highlight today has to do with connecting to the importance of relationships in learning and development. So someone mentioned in the comments, one of the challenges is there's often this false dichotomy put out there in the world between, okay, this is academics and this is social and emotional, when really we know that learning is both social and emotional. And research tells us specifically that positive developmental relationships create the conditions for students to thrive. This is especially important for students who might be experiencing a lot of stress, trauma, or adversity adversity. They're really needing those positive developmental relationships to buffer some of that. So a common challenge for me in all of my roles was, yes, the science tells us this, but that doesn't mean experientially as a teacher or an administrator, I felt like I could spend the time to prioritize relationships. I often didn't know where to start because there's tons of resources and development around how to become a better academic teacher, but where are the resources and the places for how to start when you're having a challenge understanding how to have better quality relationships with your students. So this tool I wanted to highlight is from the Trust Building Interactions Core Practice page. It's called Relationships Inventory. And the tool is way more than 2 pages, like this thumbnail suggests. It actually has multiple parts that I want to walk you through because they're all really valuable. And the inventory itself helps you collect tangible data on something that often feels intangible, like the quality of your relationships with students. So one of the first things this tool does is it asks you as an educator to actually think of each and every single one of your students that you interact with. And it asks you to actually reflect in a quantifiable way about the quality of your relationship. These are just 3 sample questions from this inventory. Instead of being like, yeah, I have a good or a bad relationships, it asks you to get more concrete. Like, can you name 3 strengths and interests the student has? What about outside of school? Have you reflected on any challenging incidents you might have had with a particular student? And this is really a way to get you thinking in a much more detailed capacity of like what your relationships and interactions with every single student might be like. And then the next part of the tool is actually an element that allows student voice to enter the equation. So instead of adults sitting around making guesses about the quality of their relationships, this is actually empowering students to share their experience. You learn from the students, how are they experiencing your relationships? So it asks students to share things like, do they feel safe and comfortable with their teacher? Is their teacher someone they can trust, like they keep their promises? Again, these are just 3 sample questions, but the idea is that it's allowing the educator to kind of triangulate information about their relationships, not just relying on their own perspective of how relationships are going. And then finally, the last part of this is really what I think makes the first 2 parts even more meaningful. There's a sample protocol and ways that you can look at the data you collect. So look at your own reflections, look at the information your students tell you about how your relationships are doing. And it's a little protocol you can use. And the reason I really appreciate this tool in general is when I think of my experience trying to make relationships important when, especially for example, in today's context, you might be pressured to focus a lot on learning loss or what are the academics of my students, is this can give you no matter what your role is, it can give you an entry point for reflecting on relationships. So as a teacher, if it's just you and you're working alone, you could reflect on this. If you're part of a grade level team or you're a grade level leader or you push into grade level teams, you could get an entire group of adults to reflect on these things at once. That would be really powerful. If you're an instructional coach and you're working with a teacher who might be experiencing challenges in some relationships with their students, you can use this tool with them as a coaching tool. And finally, if you're an assistant principal and you're planning school-wide professional learning on how to invest people in understanding about the importance of relationships, you could use a tool like this school-wide. So thank you so much for just giving me the chance to share, Elizabeth, a tool that I really appreciated. I know in the context of virtual learning, it can be even harder to value the quality of your relationships with your students. But again, the science really shows us the impact that it can have on learning. So I hope people find this tool as useful as I do.
Thanks so much, Heidi. It's great to hear about this tool, and I'm so excited about the ways that it brings in student voice and perspective. I think this came up in the chat into a data-driven conversation about improving conditions for students. So it's really great. I wish I had this tool when I was teaching. I would love to turn it to you next, Mensah, if you could share a tool or resource from the toolbox that you're particularly excited about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. As I mentioned, as a former school principal, but as a lifelong educator and as a teacher at heart, and also as a father, navigating virtual and hybrid learning with my 2 daughters in the 4th and 7th grades, as well as working from home over the past year, like many of us, I'm most excited to share a tool for supporting students in their stress management in order to build resilience. So this is a stress management plan, and it's a powerful means for trusting adults, whether that is a parent, teacher, other school staff member, to support and guide their students, their children, and recognizing and also reflecting on the strong emotions that they may feel, and then identifying healthy strategies they can practice and actually use to manage their emotions. It's critical for us as educators to remember the importance of being calm and actually modeling that expectation for our students. And this is just one way that can happen. Like the other tools in the toolbox, this has been developed and designed based on an asset-based approach that will allow students to develop a repertoire of skills and strategies for managing their emotions. I've personally utilized this tool, frankly, in working with my own children as we've navigated things from home to build their resilience and their stress management skills. So it's absolutely essential that the adult, as I mentioned, models how this resilience building actually looks. And this tool is just a way for that conversation to get started and to continue. We start by prompting the child to reflect and then list the strong emotions that they have when I feel blank, and then continue to brainstorm ideas around what they can do to manage those emotions. Here, we're actually teaching our children that they can always have a choice with what they can do with their emotions, and we're also giving them a voice and a space to acknowledge their emotions. And this is just one way that that agency is being built. We then prompt the child to think about who or what they can go to for support. These can be other trusting adults, friends. In the case of my children, our pet dogs, who we all go to for emotional support at times. So this is just an example of how that looks. And this last step of the initial process and this conversation just provides space for the child to plan some choices. When I have these strong emotions, what can I do with them? Who can I go to? So in using this with my youngest daughter, our first conversation took about 15 minutes. And this is a conversation that we have revisited many times, often weekly, over the past several months as I've witnessed her continue to build her own resilience and stress management. So providing this ongoing space for her to authentically reflect and think through strategies that she can utilize, she has been able to more readily access these strategies independently when needed. And absolutely, I wish that these were some of the things that I thought of when I was a teacher and even when I was a principal in the classroom and within the school, to make sure that all students were getting what they need and were gaining those skills that they would need to function more independently. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Mensah, for sharing that. It's wonderful to hear a little bit about how you've adapted this tool to work, even in a unique context like remote schooling. I also love how this tool allows students, your daughter included, to bring the strategies that they have into the work that they're doing to manage their stress and emotions. So I hope that they continue to benefit your daughter. Awesome. And with that, I will turn it to Laura. Laura, could you share a tool or resource with us that you're particularly excited about?
Yes. Heidi and Mensah, your experiences as educators and parents just really resonated with me. I'm sitting here just nodding my head. It's great to hear other folks that are facing the same challenges that we are. But as I mentioned when I introduced myself, I was previously an elementary educator. I taught 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade at various times here in Harlem, New York. And one challenge that I had every single year, particularly at the beginning of the year, was how do I co-create a classroom community with my students that invites them to show up as their whole selves? How do we create rules that we agree to uphold together in a way that's authentic? You know, I know that I wanted to create this physically and emotionally and identity safe space for the racially and linguistically and socioeconomically diverse group of kids that were sitting in front of me. And I also knew that that space shouldn't just be representative of my own perspective as a white woman from rural New England, but the perspectives and the values of my students and their families and our whole school community. And oftentimes I just really fell short here. We would create a couple of rules together, during morning meeting in the first week of school for like 15 minutes. We'd hang them on the wall, and that was kind of it. And not only did that feel really unsatisfactory to me, but I could tell as the year went on, the kids did not always feel ownership over our community. And that's because of how I wasn't able to set them up and empower them to feel that. And right now, so many of my friends and colleagues that are teaching are thinking about re-entry into their classrooms, or even resetting in a hybrid or a virtual space now that they've had almost a full year of experience with this new medium of teaching, and really wanting to invite their kids in as co-creators in that process and give them real voice. So the tool I am really excited about in the toolbox is one that you can use to start that process, and it lives in the supportive environments component, specifically within the core practice of expectations, norms, and routines. And so the personal and community values tool asks you to start with yourself and recognizing the perspective that you are bringing into the classroom. What are your values? Where did you learn them? How do they show up in your practice, whether that be in your classroom rules and expectations, or what student behaviors are praised, or which ones really get under your skin? And how might those be the same or different than the perspectives of your students and your families? I know, for example, I really value self-sufficiency, and that I really praised my students who worked hard to be independent. And I learned that from my own school and family experience when independence was praised in me. But I also had coworkers who really valued a more collective sufficiency and praised students when they were able to know how and when to ask each other for help. And really importantly, there is also a part of this tool that extends the opportunity to bring those values and perspectives in from students and families. There's a take-home worksheet that asks, what are 3 values that are important to our family or community? And what does it look like and feel like and sound like when we are living those values? And as a teacher, this would have given me such a richer starting place to co-create those norms and expectations with my students, talking about how our unique experiences and identities and cultures mean that we're all showing up with our own perspectives, and how we can actually use those to decide together how we will be together and really set the stage for safety and belonging. And so I hope that this tool can help others to do the same and really set our kids up to feel ownership and a sense of joy and excitement and pride to be a part of our classroom communities. And I'll hand it back to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks so much, Laura. This tool seems like such an excellent way to begin to unpack the biases and beliefs that we each bring to our work as adults in a way that really influences how classroom and school communities get set up. So I really appreciate you sharing this tool. And I'm very excited that we have a good chunk of time now for all of your questions based on your context, based on what you've learned so far, based on what's confusing you. So we already have some questions that have started to come in, but feel free to begin to add those to those, and we will start to choose some questions to respond to. It definitely looks like one of the questions that has come up a lot, and I know this is something that you've thought a lot about, Heidi, is how this content connects to the circumstances of kids who've experienced trauma and adversity during their lives. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about how the toolbox can support that work.
Yeah, I can start with that. I think this is also connected to Jenna's comment in the question and answer section, so I'm happy to speak to that. I think that what you'll notice in our site is if you're going in the redesign portion, that science of learning and development about how stress, trauma, adversity affects and impacts brain development is integrated through all of our strategies, all of the science. And that's really one of the pros, I think, of using the toolbox when it's so integrated, is it's not not as linear as like first learn about the stress, the effects of stress, then do all these strategies. It's actually a lot more integrated where, for example, I know Jenna's question referenced the what causes dysregulation, right? And then what can you do to support dysregulation, either from an environmental perspective or from a skills and mindsets perspective, or even from a relational perspective with relationships. So it really is integrated, and I encourage you to explore around all the elements for that reason. But if this is something you want to dive into as a starting place, because really we've found that sometimes starting with developing a deep understanding in others of the effects of stress, trauma, and adversity on a developing brain is often like the key entry point for getting other people to care and want to learn more about why do whole child development. I would suggest perhaps starting in the science section of the toolbox and scrolling all the way down, and you'll see a part that says learn more. And in this part of the toolbox, there are curated videos, research articles, anchor visuals, things that can really help you engage with others to help them understand the effects of stress on the brain. I think, Elizabeth, that starts to answer your question, but I want to leave it to Laura or Mensah to see if they had something else to add connected to that noticing.
Thanks so much, Heidi. That was really helpful. And I just want to remind everyone quickly that the Q&A feature is sort of right at the center of the panel that you get at the bottom of Zoom. So we have a lot of questions coming in through the chat and other ways as well, which is totally fine, but you'll increase your likelihood, I think, of getting your question answered if you stick it in that Q&A feature. Awesome. So another theme that has come up that I would love to throw to you, Mensah, is sort of how to start to approach this work when it's super out of alignment with district requirements or really at tension with sort of the core expectations within your school or school community when they're primarily focused on academics. So I'm sort of curious how you might respond to that.
Absolutely, yes. That's a struggle that I had as well as a teacher, and was actually one of my motivations to become an assistant principal and then a principal later on. So I would suggest for any teacher, any school staff person, even administrator on the call, to start small. Start within your classroom, start within your context. I don't think that any administrator, any instructional superintendent for that matter, could argue with you prioritizing relationships, prioritizing making sure that we're creating a safe, predictable context for every single child so that their brains can actually function in the optimal manner. So I'd suggest that you just start small and build investment from there. There was another question that I just tag on regarding, I think someone asked how for some examples about how you could use the well-being index, either as a school, as a whole school or within the classroom. I think even that would be just one example of a starting place. The well-being index is just a tool that can be used as a reflective mechanism to collect data around, like, what is the well-being of the kids, and what's that well-being of the kids in front of you, and how can you actually quantify that, measure that, whether that's month to month. You want to actually administer the well-being index and kind of compare. Maybe you want to start at one grade level and see how the reflections as a school staff around the data that you collect, and then the planning in terms of like, what can we actually do differently to increase the well-being of students, either individual students or an entire class, an entire school. So there are multiple starting points, but I would just encourage you to not be dismayed. We know that a lot of times academics continue to be prioritized, but we also know that that's just one measure. And even how we currently measure academics within schools, that's very limited, right? In terms of individual tests, so we know that a lot of these tests have biases, et cetera. It's just providing one measurement point, but we also need to be a lot more well-rounded as schools, as districts, as educators, to make sure that we're looking at the whole child, not just having blinders on and looking at one type of measurement. And I would offer, toss that to any of the other panelists, Heidi or Elizabeth, if you want to add anything. But yeah, that's something we talk about a lot.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, Mensah. And I love the idea of any way that you can bring data about student well-being or students' holistic experience into the conversation really resonates with me. Given my previous experiences as an educator, I think that that can be such a powerful point sort of within your own advocacy in your work as a teacher or leader or social worker or anyone within schools to move the needle in that direction. I think in some ways this question is a little bit connected, but I would love to throw to you, Laura, a question from Jenna about how this work is grounded in equity with a specific question around disproportionate outcomes in discipline and how the toolbox might support in fixing this.
That's a great question, Jenna, and something that we talk about, I would say, near constantly here at Turnaround and interrogating that in our work. The first thing that I would say is about the goal of the work and what we're driving towards. The toolbox and all of our resources and frameworks really start from an acknowledgement and an understanding that our education system in the United States was not designed for equity, and it was not designed with a whole child purpose. It was in fact designed with very racist, sexist, ableist, classist ideas of which kids were deserving and which kids weren't. And even though we have had many, many years of reform and moving forward, we're still wrestling with those foundations. And so we're starting from a place of saying, we need to reimagine the system that we have, not tinker around the edges and make small adjustments, and really go for transformation towards equity. And so that's our starting place. And then you'll see throughout the toolbox, equity is really the thread that is connecting everything together. And specifically, I noticed that you asked about discipline, and that falls into the part of our toolbox that explores how we're creating a supportive environment for kids, which really includes how do we make it physically, emotionally, identity safe for all kids, which includes things like how do we set what our rules are? And then what do we do when things go wrong and there's conflict and there's challenges? How do we respond in a way that's co-regulating, that is restorative, and that does not continue to exacerbate inequities that we see happening in the way that we often do discipline or consequence systems in our schools. And so right now there are resources live on the toolbox, as you saw, around expectations, norms, and routines, which is really the foundation of sort of discipline systems, but you'll also see in the coming months additional resources being added that specifically speak to your question about how we actually redesign how we respond in moments of challenge in more equitable ways that include things like understanding the root cause of challenges and addressing kids' holistic needs, giving kids an opportunity to own and speak their truth and ask for accountability, repairing relationships and trust in the school community. So if you'd like to also be notified when those resources are launched or any resources on our toolbox, you can sign up on our site so that you can be notified when we have those available, which will be soon.
Thanks so much, Laura. That was really helpful. And I think it's exciting to see all of the tools that we have as a starting point and also the opportunity to continue to see new tools released over the coming months. I see another question that I'm going to throw to Mensah around how we can involve families more. Sometimes Lindsay struggles with parent trust within her school community, and so she was curious about that.
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Lindsay. To be frank, I think schools, educators, we need to start with that intention of actually involving parents in the child's life, that intention of actually not just seeing that one child come into the school building, but as you look at our whole child design blueprints, right in the middle, it starts with that whole child purpose. And by that, like the whole child, you're talking about that individual child's entire context, all the strengths that they bring, all the challenges that they've experienced, all of their competencies, all of their loves, all their dislikes. So I think the intention has to be made by a school, even by a classroom educator, to involve parents more. And I think starting there, and there are lots of different ways and tools with which to do that, and avenues or entry points to really involve parents more, from just that communication mechanisms. We often talk about the actual structures that schools have created to actually involve parents. So asking yourself those kind of questions, and I'm not sure if it's on an individual teacher level or school-wide, but if there's lacking relational trust, it's probably more of a community issue, not just for an individual educator. So I think starting with that intention, even as a parent myself, oftentimes I'm not invited in to my kids' education. There are not questions that are asked in terms of what my perspectives are, what I wish that educators would ask me, for example, what I think my kids' strengths are, because parents would know better than anyone. So I think starting with the intention, and there are lots of tools that we have, but first, parents have to know that they are welcomed, they are celebrated, they are appreciated within the school setting. And oftentimes we send very explicit messages, sometimes implicit messages, that parents and caregivers aren't welcome.
Thanks so much, Mensah. And that statement really speaks to, I think, all of the work we do around really understanding that our mindsets about the way that we engage with families really, really matter, and speaks to some of our science principles around the importance of the holistic context around students and how important it is that we're engaging with everyone within a student's context. I believe that we have a question for Laura. There was a question around when we anticipate the intervention section being populated.
Love a question that I can firmly answer. As you saw in our framework, there are actually 13 core practice areas. And right now we have just the first 3 launched, and we are going to continue to add resources for all 13 of them between now and the summer, so through the rest of the year. So intervention and enrichment, which is a core practice in our knowledge, skill, and mindset building component, will be released in the coming months. And as I mentioned before, please feel free to sign up to be notified when we do so that you don't miss it.
Great. Looks like we just duplicated our responses to an anonymous attendee in the Q&A section, just about what will be available after the session. As we mentioned, you'll have the whole Toolbox site, which includes some of the content from the slides, as well as a recording of the presentation and transcript. All right, I think we have time for about one more question or thought. Does anyone have anything that resonated from the themes or notes that we had that they wanted to share before we close?
I can just share one thing. I was going to type a response to Jenna, who asked around just as she's trying to, as I'm reading the question, kind of how do we create like the coalition of the willing? How do you where do you start? How do you get like board members to how many hours should I take or days to go through everything in the toolbox? Again, I would suggest starting small, and it could be with the WholeChild design blueprint as one example, just so leaders could see what is the intention, like that they could see how all these pieces actually fit together and they make sense, so that change can actually start to gain traction and things can move forward. I would not attempt to like read through everything in the toolbox. I would again start, wherever it makes the most sense for you. Is it around looking at the discipline data and how it continues to show inequitable outcomes for students? Is it around parental engagement? And you might have multiple things that you're trying to address, but starting small and just being very specific in terms of what are the outcomes that you want to try to get towards before you look, to expand into other areas. So hopefully that was helpful.
I would also want to add, if you're looking for a specific part on the site to start, I just dropped a link specifically to our WholeChild design blueprint. So that's at least an introduction to all the different elements. So if you're looking to Mensah's point, not bombard, but where would be a meaningful place to start for different audiences, you could start by zooming out, looking at the holistic picture and saying, what might really speak to a particular group? And then you could curate a more narrow set of resources from there as one idea for where to start.
Thanks so much, Heidi. And I think we're going to have to keep moving just so that we can be respectful of people's time. But I saw another question about the blueprint. And I think in a future webinar, we can likely dig further into that topic, where the blueprint came from, and a little bit more about what it looks like to use it in school. So excited to continue to dig in with that with you all over coming sessions. All right, so we would love to learn from all of you just a little bit more about what your experience has been so far of the toolbox. Oops, sorry, I relaunched the same poll. Let me try to adjust that. Question 2. So if you could go ahead and respond to these prompts, we're curious what you're most excited to do next. That's really helpful for us, and would also love to know what tools that were shared today feel most relevant to you and your needs. And you can select as many of these as you want. All right, it looks like we have sort of a critical mass who's responded here. I'll give you just about 15 more seconds if you haven't been able to enter your response yet. Awesome. So it's great to see what your plans are next. It seems like many of you will go to continue to explore the Toolbox site, which is exciting for us. We'll speak in a moment about an opportunity you have to provide feedback as well as you're exploring the site so that we can continue to refine it and make it even better for you and your needs. It also looks like all of these tools are valuable to you all in different, at slightly different frequencies, but really excited about the impact on students if many of you go out and use that relationships inventory in the coming weeks to think about how to continue to improve relationships with your students. So thank you so much for sharing that. Awesome. And then what you can expect from us next is we'll be sending a follow-up email to all of you who've attended, which will include the recording again, a transcript of the session today, a reminder of the tools and resources that we shared specifically, and information about how to set up a Toolbox account and have access to the site as a whole. We'll also include that survey that we mentioned so that you can share any thoughts that you have. It's super important to us to continue to learn from our users about what's valuable about the Toolbox so we can make changes to make it work even better for you. You can also always reach out to us at toolbox@turnaroundusa.org with any thoughts or questions, and we'll be sure to read your email and get back to you. And with that, I guess we probably did have time for another question or two, but I think it's always good to have in some transition period. As a teacher, that was always very important to me. Thank you all so much for joining us. Again, thank you so much to our panelists and everyone who has helped with behind the scenes tech support. We have one of our data colleagues here, Emily, looking through all of your questions and themes to help us answer them really clearly. And of course, thank you all for attending and hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Any other closing thoughts, Laura, Mensah, or Heidi?
Just an appreciation for all the work we know is happening right now as we're moving into the end of the school year, and appreciation for all of you taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate all of you and what you do every single day for our children in our communities. Be well.
And just echoing my thanks and to say, please don't hesitate to reach out. We have, I know there's at least the info at tfcusa.org account. I think there might even be a specific on our website Toolbox account. Like if you're looking at one of these tools, you have a question, you have a wondering, or you were wondering something that didn't get answered during the live today, please feel free to email us. We love learning about the tools. We love interacting with people who are using the tools. It really is intended to be, they're intended to be accessible. And personally, I love answering questions about the tools. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
Wonderful, thank you.